If you're talking to an FBI negotiator, you're having the worst day of your life. My name is Gary Noesner, and I retired from the FBI after a 30-year career, and I was chief of the FBI's Crisis Negotiation Unit.
A few decades ago in San Antonio, Texas, a man climbed to the top of a radio tower. Bystanders, frightened he might jump, called the police. From 100 feet in the air, the man yelled something. It was hard to hear him with the strong winds carrying away his words. After some back and forth, the police came away with a crucial piece of information. If they didn't want him to jump, they'd have to meet his demand. At the FBI Academy in Stafford, Virginia, Gary Noesner received a call. It was the sheriff at the scene.
We're having a bit of a hard time getting down. You got any advice for us?
And I said, well, has the person asked for anything? And they said, yeah, he wants some cigarettes. And I said, well, did you give him the cigarettes? And they said, no, what do we get in return? And I said, I don't know, maybe he'll throw a leg down or an arm or something. What are you expecting? The problem with the never give without getting is it seems to be the only thing that a lot of commanders remember from a little bit of introduction to the training. But you have to think about, why did the man climb the tower today? Was it to get a cigarette? I don't think so. So you have to then assume that he's climbed that tower to do something else or for another purpose. No doubt to express his frustration, anger, whatever it might be. So he's distrustful of the police by saying, hey, we're going to put a cigarette halfway between us so you don't feel threatened. You can come down after we move away and you get your cigarette. I'm saying to him, I'm not here to make your day worse. I'm a good person. And it did, in fact, open up a dialogue that eventually led to his surrender. So sometimes in law enforcement and the military, too, we sometimes get a little bit constricted in our thinking about deals and power. The important lesson is, what do we lose? We didn't lose a thing. And the other thing we always say in negotiations, we have to be at our very best when people are at their very worst.
On the morning of August 21st, 1991, Gary's best was put to the test. Detainees awaiting repatriation to Cuba rioted at a federal prison in Alabama. They took 11 hostages. In an instant, the detainees went from having no power to having everything. I'm Doug Frazier, and this is What We Do, where you'll meet the people behind the most intriguing passions, hobbies, and jobs around the world. Alpha Building at the Talladega Correctional Facility in Georgia was now run by inmates armed with makeshift weapons. To keep police at bay, they barricaded the doors. Some of them used the chaos as an opportunity to settle scores with other detainees. The authorities formed two teams to establish communication. Gary was head of the evening shift. But the detainees weren't talking. The only communication they had with the outside world was through banners they hung from the roof. We are not hungry for food, but for freedom. Give it to us. In Gary's experience, a hostage taker's refusal to communicate usually meant one thing. They may have had power, but they didn't have a plan.
I always had bosses and commanders say, that son of a gun inside, he knows exactly what he's doing. He's manipulating us. And I would typically say, well, maybe you might be true. I said, but my experience is that in an overwhelming majority of the cases, they've gotten themselves into something that they have no idea how to get out of. They don't have a plan. They're playing this moment for moment.
The Talladega situation started in Cuba back in 1980. The Cuban government announced that anyone who wanted to leave could. The doors of Cuban prisons and mental health facilities were unlocked. Along with tens of thousands of citizens seeking asylum in the United States were hardened criminals and others in need of professional mental health facilities. 2,500 people deemed unfit to remain in the United States were arrested and moved from one facility to the next. Those with violent criminal backgrounds were stuck in limbo. Cuba didn't want them back, and the U.S. couldn't just release them. Naturally, these detainees became frustrated until one day they'd had enough. In total, 11 hostages were taken, 3 from the Immigration and Naturalization Service and 8 from the Bureau of Prisons. The inmates played it smart by only taking one of the buildings. It allowed them to cover their bases and completely secure their perimeter. In cutting themselves off from authorities, they also severed their connection with an important piece of the puzzle: food. After several days, the hostage takers and their hostages were growing weary with hunger. They made demands for food. Gary read the situation and realized his advantage. He denied their request.
As a negotiator, I'm well aware of what we call the paradox of power, and the harder we push, the more likely we are to get resistance. So we certainly believed wholeheartedly, the entire negotiation team, in pursuing the negotiation process.
The next day at lunchtime, a large grill was set up outside the Alpha unit.
I believe it was Frank Boltz or Harvey Schlossberg, the sort of two gentlemen that really started this whole negotiation business in New York City, telling me years ago about, putting some food on the barbecue grill and letting the positive smells of that emanate to the perpetrator and convincing that maybe he needed to come out and get something to eat. So yeah, we purposely did that in Talladega. The inmates had not eaten for quite some time, and we decided that in that state, that smelling some steaks that the guys outside were eating probably would be an incentive for them to be a little bit more cooperative.
The tactic, known as aromatic warfare, worked. The inmates wanted to talk. A member of the hostage negotiation unit who spoke Spanish approached the prisoners. Once he was 30 feet away, he stopped. Gary followed behind to act as a coach, but also to keep his partner from accidentally risking his life. When we talk, we have a tendency to move closer. As his partner inched forward, Gary reminded him to move back. And as the conversation drew on, the movements increased. Gary wound up holding the back of his partner's jacket to keep him locked in at a safe distance. There was no deal made for food. Instead, they released a hostage in exchange to share their stories with a reporter for El Nuevo, the Spanish-speaking edition of the Miami Herald. The freed hostage revealed a dire insight. What leadership existed among the inmates was toppling over. Cooler heads were losing to the more dangerous, violent inmates.
There was an unraveling. They had drawn names, put them in a hat, and they were going to start killing them.
It was time to make a move.
We decided we were going to have to do a tactical rescue, and in order to sort of set them up for that, we, for the first time in 8 days, gave them quite a sumptuous meal, and knowing that they would celebrate, feel empowered, they were now on top, they could make us do whatever we want and let down their guard.
Gary and his team set in the richest, most filling foods possible: steak and potatoes with gravy, pies, cakes, the works. As Gary had hoped, the starved inmates gorged on the food. Through the communication lines, the prisoners could be heard celebrating. The risk to the hostages had been eliminated. For now. Later that night, the prisoners, who finally had full stomachs after nearly 10 days of not eating, fell into a deep, high-caloric sleep. When the clock struck 3:43 a.m., they were rocked from their slumber by the sound of detonating explosives. SWAT and HRT members stormed the building. The siege went off without a single bullet being fired. All hostages were unharmed, and 31 of the Cuban detainees were boarded on a plane to Cuba the next day. As Gary says in his book, Stalling for Time, the evidence suggested that the rich food and sense of victory combined to lull the prisoners into a complacent slumber. Seeing people on these worst days, like we mentioned earlier, do you think people are inherently good?
Well, I think so. I mean, it's not what happens to us in life, it's how we react to it or how we feel about it. And, if you're being practical or realistic, there's a lot of people who either through their own shortcomings or through life's vagaries have, been dealt a bad hand, or their life has not turned out the way they wanted. And human beings they get frustrated, they act out. Yeah, but I still believe even some of the most desperate and sometimes despicable people I've talked to, there's almost always some good in there. Even the worst of characters wants to be respected, wants to be shown dignity, wants to be treated fairly, wants to be listened to. I'm not there to scold this guy or to try to change his life long term. I'm trying to create a relationship where he understands that, that I appreciate what he's going through and how he feels about it. And I'm there to try to help him and not hurt him. And I think that's the real key to success in almost all situations. During my career, I spent the last 23 years as a negotiator and the last 10 as the chief negotiator. And I was involved in a lot of prison riots, right-wing militia standoffs, hijackings, kidnappings, a whole host of interesting and challenging events, either that the FBI was directly involved in or helping local law enforcement.
You mentioned in your book that there's sort of this shared traumatic circumstance, and some people, some of the hostage takers, under different circumstances, you might have been friends with. Is that something that still rings true now, that reflecting back on the days?
I think so. There's one perpetrator in one big case that I'm still in touch with. We're Facebook friends. We have different ideologies about life, but and I got an email from another one the other day. So, it doesn't happen too frequently, but, if you really engage with someone in a sincere and genuine way, that creates the ultimate success tool for a negotiator, which is likability. And if somebody comes away liking you, it should be of no surprise that they have a positive memory of you, or occasionally want to say, how are you? What's going on in your life? I think that's a real compliment to a positive relationship that you forged in a very short, compressed, tense period of time. So that's why I always teach my audiences, if you can do that in those kind of circumstances, then, it stands to reason that it's going to work in more normal life interactions, less dangerous life events. And it does.
Hey guys, thanks so much for listening. Would you mind leaving a rating and review for the show? It only takes a moment and it's a huge help. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new episodes. Until next time, stay curious. What We Do is produced by me, Doug Frazier, for WHRO Public Media.